Thank you. Greetings. I'm Judith Sebesta, a first-year board member for the Open Education Conference, and I would like to welcome you to the 2023 Open Ed Conference. The Open Education Conference Board of Directors recognizes that our mission to advance open access is inherently linked to the righteous pursuit of decolonization led by people subjected to ongoing settler colonialism. Withholding access to knowledge is one extension of ongoing theft of land and genocide rooted in white supremacist colonialism. We specifically acknowledge the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, including the lands known to settlers as the United States of America and Canada, where this conference has previously convened in person and where many participants join from today. We uplift the courageous resistance of Turtle Island's indigenous people who show us every day what it looks like to choose life in the face of colonial violence, to choose unapologetic existence in the face of erasure, and liberation in the face of suppression. We call on those in our community who are settled on these particular lands to follow the lead of indigenous people in reimagining ways of being that honor our collective humanity. So for tangible starting points, please consider the following, and my colleagues will be putting links to these in the chat, I do believe. Learn more about the depth, breadth, and complexity of Indigenous history on the land by visiting Native Land, an app that maps Indigenous lands in Canada in a way that changes, challenges, and improves the way people see history and present day. And Mike, I want to correct, I believe that they map Indigenous lands everywhere. If you are in Canada, though, learn more about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQ2S+ people from the National Association of Friendship Centers. And if you are in the United States, learn more about Stop Cop City and the movement to defend the land of the Wilani Forest in Atlanta. Now I will turn it over to my fellow board member, Tanja Connerly, for our official welcome to Open Ed 23.
Thank you very much, Judith. Good morning and good afternoon to some of you as well. Welcome to the 2023 Open Education Conference. My name is Dr. Tanja Connerly, and I have the honor and privilege of representing your elected board of directors. We, the board, would like to thank you for allowing us the opportunity of being a part of this event, as well as the open education community. This is the 20th annual gathering of the Open Education Conference community, and this is reflected in this year's theme, Innovation and Practice, Celebrating 20 Years of Community. This theme reflects our commitment to both the past and the future of open education, as well as being together in the present. Over the past 20 years, the open education community has made incredible progress. We've created and shared millions of open educational resources. We've developed new teaching and learning practices that are more open and inclusive. And we've advocated for policies that support open education at all levels. This was done by each of you. So I really think that you guys deserve a round of applause. Even though it's early in the morning, I think you deserve a hip hip hooray for that. But there is still much work for us to be done. For us to do. Education is still not accessible or affordable for everyone, and too many people are still denied the opportunity to learn and grow. That's why it's so important for us to come together as a community at the Open Education Conference. We need to share our ideas, collaborate on solutions, and support each other's work. We need to recognize each other as the amazing champions for students that we are. This year's conference program is packed with opportunities to learn, connect, and even be inspired. We have incredible keynote speakers. We have sessions on a wide range of topics, from open pedagogy to open policy. And we have plenty of opportunities to network and socialize with our colleagues from around the world. I encourage you to take full advantage of all the conference has to offer. Please get involved in the sessions, participate in the discussion, and connect with new people. As we were logging in, you saw people from Tokyo, from Canada, New York. So we have lots of ways in order for us to connect and to meet new people. Together, we can build a more open, equitable, and accessible education system for everyone. In my closing today, I would like to challenge each of you to contribute to our OER community for the next 20 years. And by the end of our session, please let us know exactly what you will do in order to contribute to make sure that we're sustainable in the next 20 years. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Open Education Conference, we welcome you and we look forward to seeing you next week. I will now pass the mic over to my colleague and my friend, Sarah.
Thank you, Tanja. I am Sarah Stokes. I am a first-year board member for the Open Ed Conference. And my role today is to thank our sponsors. Open Ed 23 owes its success in part to these incredible sponsors. Their unwavering support has empowered us to promote open education, fostering innovation and collaboration. We're deeply grateful for their commitment to our mission, and we would like to thank all of our sponsors, including the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Michelson 20 Million Minds Foundation, as well as eCampus Ontario, OpenStax, and Pressbooks. Thank you for being integral to our open education journey. And with that, I'd like to pass the mic over to my friend and colleague, Rachel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Meisner, and this is my second year serving on the board of directors. And this is the 20th annual gathering of the conference community. So it's our 20th anniversary. To celebrate this milestone, we have created a collaborative board where members of the conference community can share their memories, well wishes, and other messages. And I'm going to go ahead and put that link to the Kudo board in the chat. Please feel free to fill out this board, and we will share out some highlights from this board at the closing plenary, which features our student keynote panel. As we go into the conference for the next few days, we want to center ourselves in what matters most: students. Students have always been at the heart of the open education movement and its deep connection to equity. It's codified in the conference's strategic vision to support and uplift student voices and center our practices on their success. Students are the future of both our movement and of our world, and yet their voices can be overlooked, dismissed, or even silenced. The conference will close with a student keynote panel, and we encourage you all to reflect on what you can do to uplift and support student voices in your own work. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Tanja.
Thank you, Rachel. Before we move on to our keynote, we're going to take a few minutes just to learn more about who is in the room and to get acquainted with our OER community today. Aisha and I will be partnering in this section in order for us to learn more about who is actually in the house today.
Thank you so much, Tanja. So hi, everyone. My name is Aisha. I am part of the Open Education Conference staff, and I'm so happy to be with you all today. So for this next part of our interactive presentation, we want to hear from you all, where you're all joining in from. So to do that, we are going to be using a tool called Mentimeter. So the instructions to sign up for that is to just go to menti.com and enter the code on the screen, which is 3633-6340, or you can also use your phone to scan the QR code on the screen. Or the easiest way, in my suggestion, is to use the link that one of my colleagues is going to pop into the chat, and you can click that and it will take you right there. So as you all are getting set up for Mentimeter, I just want to share a little bit about where everyone is coming from and how many of there are joining us. So we have over 1,700 participants. That includes both attendees and presenters joining us. and they are coming from all over. So we have all 50 states represented, which is really, really cool to see. And we have many Canadian provinces as well. So I know a lot of people shared earlier where they were from in the chat. We love to see everybody tuning in, and feel free to also share what time it is where you currently are. I know that I saw some people came from Tokyo, some people came from Canada, West Coast, East Coast. So it'll be really interesting to see what time you are all joining us. And as for globally, we have over 60 countries being represented today and throughout the next couple of days at the Open Education Conference. So we love how much of a global presence we're having. Of course, we always want to expand this, but thank you all so much for those who are coming outside of the US and Canada. I know that it is difficult, especially with the time differences, but we appreciate and love that you are all here. So to put Mentimeter to work, our first question for you all is, where are you joining from? So I know you all put it in the chat earlier, but if you can share it into the Mentimeter, it can pop up on the screen, and it will also show us where the most popular place is. So many responses coming in at once. This is really cool to see. Of course, Texas is in the center. Love that. So I'm actually based in Maryland on Piscataway territory, but I'm coming from the West Coast today, in California. So it's quite early where I am. Seeing a lot of Texas, Florida, DC, love that, DMV, New Jersey, Kansas, seeing a lot of the US, Canada, Ontario. Love that. So yeah, you could keep adding your answers in. And for the next question, I am going to pass it over to Tanja. Thank you all.
Thank you, Aisha. Utilizing your Mentimeter, can you please answer the next question? What is your primary profession? I know that I am a full-time faculty member here in Houston, Texas at San Jacinto College. So I'm just dying to see who else is represented here at our Open Ed conference.
Lots of librarians.
Lots of librarians, my favorite people to partner with.
Students, love that. Thank you all for joining. Nonprofit, so I'm from a nonprofit as well, love that. As always, librarians carrying our community. We love to see it. Okay, so on to the next question. Now, how many times have you all attended the Open Education Conference before now? Ooh, first time attendees. So this is my third Open Education Conference that I will be at this year. I love how much we have first time attendees. That's so good to see. For our first time attendees, if you want to share in the chat how you heard about the Open Education Conference, that would be really cool to know how you got connected with this. Oh my gosh, we have 2 people who are 10 plus. Whoever voted 10 plus, those 2 people, please share in the chat. That is so cool. 3 people now that you have been to so many. All right, so this is slowing down. I'm gonna go to the next one.
Okay. So our next question says, what motivates your interest and participation in our Open Ed and Open Education? Okay, we have equity, which is so important. Students' needs, so that's a part of the whole equity in reference to accessibility. We have cost, making it affordable for our students. We have equity and social justice.
Yeah, seems like
equity and accessibility.
A lot of focus on equity, which I love to see.
Okay.
Oh wow, I just learned I can scroll. That's crazy.
And a lot of these will, a lot of your interests will also be, if you had an opportunity to look at your program, We will have a lot of workshops pertaining to how you can continue to have accessibility and affordabilities at your college, as well as maintaining student success. So we have a lot of these workshops that will be available for you during this week. So please look at your program and start highlighting your schedule and bookmarking the workshops you would like to attend.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm seeing a lot for students. So in case you didn't know, we have a student panel closing us out on Thursday. So please attend that and you can ask them questions and it's going to be amazing. So love that so many people are here for students. All right. Thank you all for these answers. So our last question for you all is, what do you hope to get out of this conference? Learning new things about open education, new ideas. That seems to be leading. Yes, connections around open education.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that we all love about conferences. It's just meeting new people and making those connections that is very hard to make when you're not at a convening.
Networking. Okay, we will have networking in reference to your experience, your field expertise, and we will also have networking pertaining to regions, Europe, United States. So we'll have lots of networking going on.
Indigenous vibes, I love that. And we do have a few presentations in the program that center on Indigenous perspectives. So I encourage you to check that out. Yeah, so thank you all. This is all amazing. I agree with everything here. Thank you all for collaborating and being part of this. So before we pass it off to our amazing keynote, I just want to remind you all that we are very active on social media and our handle is the same for everything. It's at Hey Open Ed. Be sure to follow us, to tag us. We are checking constantly, and that to use the hashtag OpenEd23, which we are also very active on and constantly checking. And we love to see you promoting your sessions and promoting what you went to, as well as just being able to see how you all are feeling about the conference. So with that, I'm going to pass it on over to Brandon to introduce our keynote.
Hello, folks. My name is Brandon Carson, and it is my second year on the board. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani. Dr. Jhangiani is the Vice Provost Teaching and Learning at Brock University in Ontario, Canada, where he is cross-appointed in educational studies and psychology, and is affiliated with the Social Justice Inequity in Studies program and the Social Justice Research Institute. His scholarship focuses on open education practices, inclusive pedagogies, and ethical approaches to educational technology, and includes dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, including a social justice framework and an institutional self-assessment scale for open educational practices, 3 open textbooks in psychology, and 2 co-edited open access books, Open, the Philosophy and Practices that are Revolutionizing Education and Science, published by Ubiquity Press, and Open at the Margins, Critical Perspectives on Open Education, published by the Rebus Community. The architect of Canada's first zero textbook cost degree programs, Dr. Jhangiani. Dr. Jhangiani is a recipient of the Award of Excellence in Open Education from BC Campus, an Emerging Leader Award for Open Education Global. Without further ado, I'm honored to pass the stage to our keynote speaker, Dr. Jhangiani.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Brandon, and good morning, everyone. It really is a treat to be here and to see how many people are attending for the first time as well. I'm deeply honored by the invitation by the Board of Directors to speak today to help open our 20th annual gathering. I want to acknowledge also the significant amount of labor undertaken by each of you, the committee members, staff, proposal reviewers, all behind the scenes in service of this growing community. And I do want to acknowledge the operational support provided to the conference since its transition to community-owned by the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition. As the boss says, you can't start a fire without a spark. So today, I do want to talk about what it means to build open community. What are the design goals? What is the necessary infrastructure? What is the architectural style? What is the social contract? And what sustains us? So over the next 45 minutes or so, I hope to draw on lessons from years of building and working with community builders and preserving an open education to critically consider how we might build an open future that is in fact designed for justice. But I want to first begin by dedicating this talk to a dear friend, colleague, and collaborator, Arlie McNeely, who sadly passed earlier this year, and whose loss I think I will always feel. Arlie was the best of us, an exceptional instructor of applied communications at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, a disability rights activist, a Paralympian, an author, a compassionate, trauma-informed open educator, a wonderful collaborator, an amazing mother, and a true friend. The ripples of change that resulted from Arlie's touch will continue to spread and touch many of our lives for years to come. I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from my home, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish First Nation in what is also known as North Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. This, as you can see, is a breathtaking place. It's situated between the mountains and the water, which is why the Squamish Nation is among the Coast Salish peoples for whom a traditional saying is, when the tide goes out, the table is set. Now, as an immigrant settler, I reflect deeply on the history of this land, on which I live, work, and play, on which my wife and I have been blessed to raise our children. And I honor the wisdom, the teaching, the languages, and the traditions of the ancestors who've been on this land since time immemorial. A territorial acknowledgement, like the one I just provided, is, of course, only the tiniest reflection of the ongoing process of truth and reconciliation here in Canada. Truth, of course, must come before reconciliation, and this includes not denying nor minimizing the historical or indeed the ongoing violence perpetrated against Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and beyond. Many of you will know that over the past few years, there have been thousands of unmarked graves discovered at the sites of former residential schools across Canada. These were places where Indigenous children were taken, far away from their families, as part of a government-sponsored, church-perpetrated campaign to educate the Indian out of the child, a form of cultural genocide that both Canada and the Catholic Church have acknowledged far too late. I share this with you in part to illustrate how education has been and continues to be weaponized. As educators, it is incumbent upon us to not gloss over the injustices of the past as we seek to build a more just future. And as the Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, Chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission said, education got us into this mess, and education will get us out of it. So I'll share that my own personal journey of reconciliation has involved not just a lot of learning, but also a lot of unlearning. And I'm grateful to have also been able to learn from Indigenous elders, colleagues, and students. We may all be at different stages in our personal journeys, but what is more important is that we are all on this journey, paddling together. Now, given the theme of this year's conference, innovation and praxis building on 20 years of community, I will share with you that over the last few months, I've been reflecting on the advancements of the past 20 years. So much of what is a reality of the landscape of open education today, from the creation of OER librarian positions to the development of zero textbook cost degree programs, from open education research mentorship networks to the growing embrace of open pedagogies by educators. From the 2007 Cape Town Open Education Declaration to the 2019 UNESCO recommendation on open educational resources, all of this was but a dream 20 years ago. That this is all a reality today is really the result of a lot of quiet, unseen labor, often a labor of love, certainly, but that does not change the reality of the amount of labor it has taken behind the scenes to bring so many visions to fruition. The conference theme has also led me to reflect on the question of community. Or perhaps I should say communities, because of course, ours is not a single unitary homogeneous community, but rather an ever-expanding and beautiful patchwork of many communities that have common threads running through them. I've learned a lot about community building from working with many dedicated people, weavers, who pour their hearts and of course their labor into advancing access to education that is equitable, affordable, and inclusive. And it is some of these lessons that I hope to share with you today. I really hope that these reflections are helpful to both experienced practitioners as well as being accessible to newer colleagues. Now, admittedly, a lot of what I will share today may feel celebratory because although I will be the first person to say we have a long way to go, we nevertheless have a lot to celebrate. So as I touch on specific projects or groups or community leaders, please do unabashedly show them your love in the chat. And appropriately, my first lesson about building community in open education comes via Arlie, who created this beautiful liner cut print last year, featuring a powerful quote by her friend, disabled activist and policy analyst, Gabrielle Peters. Make it accessible or burn it down. This motto is not about being polite when you are being denied dignity. It is not about asking nicely in the hope that you will be seen as human. This is about saying no to inaccessible spaces, saying no to half measures and accommodation, and a resounding yes to crushing ableism. Sales of merchandise bearing this motto raised more than $3,000, a sum that enabled Arlie and Peters to buy pizzas for every warming center in Vancouver last year, on December 21st, 2022. This was one of the coldest nights of the year. Now, to be clear, this was not charity, which is when one party with resources or power gives to another party with fewer resources and power, but this was mutual aid. This was when people come together as equals to ensure that everyone has the resources that they need. And as you can see, this wonderful story was picked up on the local news, and it was in the final line of that story that Peters, incisive as ever, was quoted again. Community is a verb, not a noun. It's the act of doing. It's being present and making things happen in whatever way you can. And there you have it. Community is a verb. It isn't some mythical place nor a necessary outcome of a group of people coming together. It manifests through intention and action. And this goes back to our conference theme, which refers to praxis. This is a concept that the Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire understood as reflection and action directed at the structures that need to be transformed. Arlie engaged in praxis, and she practiced community every day. She practiced it with colleagues. I remember fondly an early conversation with Arlie and our mutual friend and collaborator, Melissa Ashman. This was in Arlie's office, and we were talking about how we could address some of the barriers that stood between our faculty colleagues who shared our commitment to equitable access to education and the structural barriers that inhibited their fuller embrace of open educational practices. You can see one outcome of Arlie's practice of community in her open textbook, Business Writing for Everyone, which involved collaboration with communicators from diverse backgrounds in order to meet the needs of a diverse student population. And among the acknowledgements in this book, you will see the names of 30 students, almost all racialized, who reviewed early drafts and provided thoughtful feedback. But my favorite example of Arlie's work comes from when she practiced community in the classroom. For example, she routinely empowered her applied communication students to choose their own research question, to pick something that mattered deeply to them. And here's an example of the kind of research report that they came up with. But the specific occasion I'm thinking of was when 2 of her classes chose as their research question the impact of textbook costs on students. The students then engaged in collaborative research, including surveys of and interviews with other students, and they wrote this report. But they didn't just stop there, because the next phase of the project involved them recreating the report for different audiences. And that's when a group of 3 creative students developed a board game about textbook affordability, based entirely on this report and the real lived experiences of their peers. And the game included everything from decisions about which books they could afford to purchase or rent, or the ones they would have to do without, to dealing with random life events, positive or negative, that could influence their financial circumstances or their academic performance. Arlie and the students then presented their research and facilitated a tabletop playing of the game at the Cascadia Open Education Summit in Vancouver in April of 2019. And without a doubt, this student-led session was one of the highlights of that conference. Now, shortly after that conference, Arlie and I worked with the wonderful tech wizard and the generous community builder known as Alan Levine to try to adapt the students' game into an interactive web format using H5P's branching scenarios embedded within the Pressbooks publishing platform. I'm happy to say that the game is openly licensed. It's available for you to play, or even perhaps to use as a faculty development tool. It's not easy, but that's the point. It's not easy for students. I will say I will always be indebted to Arlie for teaching me how to how powerful the practice of community can be. And so this is also why I invite you now to take a moment to reflect on one or more people who've paved or lit your own path into this space, who've practiced community by introducing you to open education, who helped you to find meaning or method or belonging in this work, who helped you to reflect and direct your actions at the structures that need to be transformed. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the term chat waterfall, but this is when everybody writes something in the chat, but does not hit enter or send until the signal's given. And then once the signal's given, of course, you have this wonderful flowing cascade in the chat, a waterfall. I'd love to try this with you now by inviting you to take a moment to type the name or names of people who've practiced community with you in open education so that they may be recognized and their labor and care made visible. But don't hit send or enter just yet. Let's first give people a few seconds to type. I'll count us down to collectively hitting enter, and then we will witness a waterfall of gratitude. Here we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Go for it. Oh my God. That is beautiful, folks. Thank you very much for doing that. And so there really is lesson 1, as you're seeing in the chat. Community is a verb. My second lesson about community building comes really from the start of my own journey in open education. At the time, I was a faculty member minding my own business, accustomed to academic hierarchies and gatekeeping and elitism, and yes, also customary practices such as department contracts with commercial publishers to assign expensive textbooks to students in exchange for promises to sponsor conferences, right? Really, really part of the landscape back then, maybe now. But then I came across a group known as BC Campus. Incidentally, BC Campus is also celebrating 20 years of changing the face of post-secondary education in our province. Happy birthday, my friends. I first engaged with BC Campus shortly after the launch of the BC Open Textbook Project, which was funded by our Ministry of Advanced Education with the goal of creating, adapting, or otherwise harvesting open textbooks for the 40 highest enrolled undergraduate courses in our province. And of course, their collection now includes hundreds of books that have been adopted by almost 1,000 faculty members at every institution in the province, over $36 million in student savings, of course. But back then, they were simply looking for faculty members to review an initial set of open textbooks that they had identified. So I put my hand up to review one of those, and then I discovered another one that wasn't on their list. This was for research methods in psychology. And so I asked them, can I please review this one as well? And the wonderful Mary Burgess and Clint Lalonde at BC Campus said, yes, absolutely. Now, I do not want to gloss over that decision because they could have easily said, no, this is the list of books that we found. This is the list of books we need reviewed. We cannot compensate you for reviewing something else. But they were flexible. They cared more about the goal than about control. And so the result is that I reviewed the book. I found that it met maybe about 80% of my criteria. Excuse me, I downloaded the editable version and I revised it over a few weeks in the summer. I adopted it for the fall semester. And so as you can see, this was a very light adaptation as adaptations go. I added a table of contents, I made changes to a couple of chapters, corrected errors, changed spellings, added a cover page. Very, very light adaptation, but it was enough for me to get going. But that was 2013. 2 years later, I worked with another colleague, Ai-Chan Chiang, to create a much more comprehensive version of a Canadian edition of this text. And that's when the book decided to take on a life of its own. This was adapted further in 2017 by my former colleague in graduate school, Dana Layton, who at the time was at Southern Arkansas University, who created the second US edition. Then another friend, also from graduate school at the University of British Columbia, Carrie Cutler, who was working at Washington State University, added significantly to Dana's labor to create the third US edition. There was also other forking and adaptations along the way by folks including Matthew Crump from Brooklyn College and faculty members at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. And then in the summer of 2019, Carrie, Dana, and I joined forces at Kwantlen Polytechnic University in the summer to make a series of updates and revisions to produce the fourth edition of this text, drawing on feedback from peer reviewers, coordinated by the wonderful Rebus community, and supplementing the text with a series of ancillary resources, also developed in partnership with Rebus. And so today, the open textbook that Carrie, Dana, and I worked on enjoys many positive faculty reviews, but it continues to be adopted and adapted around the world, unassisted by us. This, I don't know whether this would have all started though, without BC Campus being supportive, being flexible, and empowering me in 2013. What I do know is that BC Campus taught me many important small lessons: the importance of peer advocacy, how much of a difference it makes when you meet people where they are at, when you keep the big picture in mind, when you do not seek to tightly control the shape of other people's designs, and when you realize that building community is not the same thing as requiring people to inhabit a space that's constrained by the limits of your imagination. And so this is also why I especially appreciate the efforts to build not just community, but also capacity by groups that provide training and mentorship, including the Open Education Network, Spark, the fabulous Regional Leaders of Open Education program, and the OER Research Fellowships. Shout out to Virginia Clinton Lissell, who I see in the chat, and the Global OER Graduate Network as well. This brings me to lesson 2. Build community by empowering others. But the journey of the open textbook that I was telling you about also, I think, illustrates a few other principles. For one, an open educational resource is not just a gift to the world. It is a gift that actually keeps on giving in a way that actually makes it dearer each time it is re-gifted. And while it is true that open licensing dramatically amplifies the impact of intellectual work, there is a far shinier side to that coin. And that is the joy you feel as an author when you know that you will only ever be aware of the thinnest slice of the positive impact in this world of the OER that you create. This to me is akin to the understanding held by many societies around the world that our purpose here is to plant trees under whose shade we shall never sit. To me, this understanding is part of what it means to be an open educator, to appreciate the richness one experiences through generosity. It also, for me, helps explain some of the tensions that have arisen when, shall I say, capitalists cosplay open education, engaging in what may be known as open washing or FOPEN sometimes. This includes at this conference, to be honest, which at times in its past has given an uncritical platform to those who sought to undermine or even dismantle it. I still remember when I first heard the term free riders being used to describe people who reuse OER without contributing anything back to the commons. It was at the 2015 Open Education Conference in Vancouver during a session led by a vendor. And I remember feeling both confused and deeply uncomfortable with that characterization. And I was looking around to see if I was the only one who felt like they had tumbled through the looking glass. It was especially confusing to me because as an educator and an OER creator, I want not only my students, but I want other educators to reuse my work. To me, that is actually the whole point of it all. Free riders isn't a problem if you believe in public infrastructure. And I don't think I was the only one feeling this way. In my mind, there was a basic understanding that was missing over here. When you build in the commons, by definition, you are not building for yourself. Building in the commons does not confer ownership. It involves stewardship. Even the knowledge that we share in OER isn't ours. I sometimes think of this as standing by a flowing river. Right? If you're a venture capitalist, your instinct may be to create a dam and monetize the water by creating artificial scarcity and even drought. But as open educators, our purpose is to roll up our sleeves, clear some debris from the water, ensuring better and clearer access to people downstream. As open educators, it is our social contract to serve as stewards of bodies of knowledge to ensure that they flow, especially to those who have historically been denied access. Cable Green, director of Open Knowledge at Creative Commons, touched on the issue of stewardship last month during his keynote address at Open Education Global, when he said that, and I quote, equitable and socially just sharing of public goods should be at the core of any open knowledge model. And further, that publicly funded knowledge should be stewarded by public institutions, the academy, or trusted nonprofit organizations. Now, his point, to be clear, was not that one cannot work with commercial organizations, not at all, but rather that these should be understood as works for hire, and that copyright to publicly funded knowledge should never be transferred to such groups. So to go back to my river metaphor, you may buy a boat, you may rent a ferrying service, absolutely, but you do not make the mistake of transferring the rights to the water itself. Why? because you cannot fully reconcile a primary obligation to shareholders to a primary duty to the commons. This is also why the infrastructure of the commons needs to be open to ensure that we are not erecting technical or cost barriers to accessing the water downstream. This is why most of us build with open source tools, whether with Pressbooks, Manifold, Open Journal Systems, H5P, Hypothesis, or many other platforms. Otherwise, just as Twitter has become the X platform, in both implications of the phrase, we risk losing it all at the whims of those who seek to fetter, to control, to exploit, or to reinforce their own privilege. Stewardship in open education does not involve fettering access to OER or jealously guarding one's strategic advantage. Building in the commons is not the same thing as building a gated community. And as Lisa Petrides, Douglas Levin, and C. Edward Watson wrote in their CARE framework, what all good OER stewards should have in common is a commitment to practices to serve to demonstrate their duty of care to the broader OER movement. So again, lesson 3. Building in the commons does not confer ownership. It involves stewardship. One of the most beautiful and perhaps one of the simultaneously most challenging things about the last 20 years in open education, frankly, is that we had to build as we were climbing. This meant that it required vision to imagine what this new world would look like, but also creativity, collaboration, and frankly, courage, because often you were the only faculty member in your department, the only librarian or educational technologist at your university, or maybe the only program officer in your granting organization who saw and who shared this vision. Now, this work isn't easy today, but I can tell you over the past 20 years, the constraints have often been even greater. And these constraints varied greatly. In some cases, you actually had a government saying, here's a tiny amount of funding that you somehow need to stretch to achieve all of your goals. And if you manage to pull this off, you just might get more funding next year. And in another case, a government might say, here is a massive amount of funding that you need to responsibly spend in the next 11 months. And if you do not manage to pull this off, you should definitely not bother asking us for funding again. And these kinds of constraints meant that the stakes were high for many hardworking folks who were trying to build a model or even a proof of concept. There was a sense of responsibility to the broader community to really try to get it right, and admittedly some pressure not to let people down. And while mistakes have undoubtedly been made along the way, there have been many iterative improvements and lessons learned. And so I especially appreciate the efforts that so many community builders have made along the way to openly share their thinking and their tools, their motivations and their methods, in other words, their blueprints, in a way that enables others to draw on their experiences and their designs. Here are some of my favorite examples. Consider this valuable guide is edited by Elizabeth Mays on making open textbooks with students, published by the Rebus community in 2017. Or this fabulous field guide for academic librarians about OER, co-edited by Andy Weselick, Jonathan Lashley, and Anne Langley, published in 2018 by Pacific University Press. Or this wonderful OER starter kit by Abby Elder. Abby, I see you in the chat. Your work is seen, published by Iowa State University Digital Press in 2019. Or this important manual on marking open and affordable courses, edited by Sarah Hare, Jessica Kirshner, who's also here with us today, and Michelle Reed, published in 2020 by Mavs Open Press. Or this toolkit for instructors and institutions, published by the partners associated with the growing United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Open Pedagogy Fellowship in 2021. Debbie Baker, you're here as well. Or the GoGN Research Methods Handbook, published by the Open Education Research Hub at the Open University. This is incredible work, folks. I also want to highlight the impressive suite of resources produced by the Open Education Network, including everything from their OER Publishing Toolkit and Pub 101 curriculum to their Open Pedagogy Student Toolkit and Open Pedagogy Learning Circle curriculum. The incredible resources from BC Campus, including their Faculty OER Toolkit, Print on Demand Guide, Open Textbook Accessibility Toolkit. And I would be remiss if I did not share this exceptional volume on the intersections of OER and information literacy, co-edited by Mary Allen Cullen and Elizabeth Dill, published in 2022 by the Association of College and Research Libraries, or the incredible work of Josh Bollick, Maria Bond, and Will Cross, who since 2017 have been leading an IMLS-funded project aimed at developing a corpus of OER for teaching library students and professionals about scholarly communications work in libraries, including this fabulous new volume titled Scholarly Communication Librarianship and Open Knowledge, just published by ACRL. Believe me, there are many, many, many other examples to choose from, but the lessons remain the same. For one, it is in part about the power of building collaboratively. Second, it's worth acknowledging, once again, the consistent efforts of librarians in helping our community to navigate or wayfind this space, even as they deal with academic hierarchies on the one hand and vocational awe on the other. But perhaps more than anything, the lesson is about the importance of ensuring that we make it easy for others to build using our designs. So lesson 4, when you build in the open, you share your blueprints. But as we talk about blueprints, we should also reflect on our desired architectural style. And as I've already mentioned, this, I don't think, is about building an exclusive gated community. So to borrow from concepts used in the world of open source software, are we envisioning building something that resembles a cathedral or something that looks a little bit more like a bazaar? When I think about the world of legacy commercial textbook publishers, it seems to me more a cathedral approach. And by that, I mean it is top-down. It's a small elite group of people involved in the design. It is designed to convey authority, to be pristine, to resist change. It is where the unwashed masses are expected to go to receive enlightenment from the high priests who gatekeep knowledge. And more often than not, this model involves the collection of money while assembling a fortune. Now, I will suggest that many of these precepts are, to some degree, antithetical to the goals of open education, which have a lot more to do with democratizing both access to knowledge as well as access to knowledge creation. So instead of cathedrals, I imagine us welcoming people to engage in the delights of a beautiful, spicy bazaar, one that gives us the ingredients we need to serve our local communities and where we are free to set up our stalls ourselves. Or maybe it is more like a community center with spaces where people can learn and grow, but also just connect with one another. Once again, some concrete examples to share. I think about the Open Faculty Patchbook, that amazing community quilt of pedagogy that our friend Terry Green envisioned and helped assemble. Each patch focuses on a single pedagogical skill that is contributed by a different faculty member. Or the corresponding Open Learner Patchbook, which houses the stories of how learners learn in higher education. Of course, we could look at the Open Pedagogy Notebook, which Robin DeRosa and I co-created, and which was intended as a space where people could browse through examples of open pedagogy in practice, while also contributing their own open pedagogical experiments. Or the Open Education Network's Open Pedagogy Portal, to which Robin and I now redirect contributors, and where educators can once again browse, learn, and share, and which also benefits from a growing suite of resources and delicious recipes. Or, just adding to it now, the Scholarly Communications Notebook, the locus of an active, inclusive, empowered community of practice for teaching ScholComm, including open education, to emerging librarians. And of course, you could add lots along the way. You could talk about the Rebus community. You could talk about the Open Education Global Connect platform. You could talk about the Creative Commons education platform, all of which also serve as community hubs. But all of it still means to me that lesson 5 is about the importance of democratizing space in the commons. Mind you, democratizing space does not imply a lack of variety. Quite the opposite, in fact, because the beauty of a bazaar lies in its variety. Right? Imagine someone who is interested in finding, and I know I'm stretching the metaphor over here, a tasty open textbook for their introductory psychology course, right? They can come across a fantastic option from OpenStax, the group based at Rice University that since 2012 have been publishing high quality, peer-reviewed, openly licensed college textbooks. Right? They focus on high enrollment undergraduate courses, and they've brilliantly advanced their goals. They're pragmatically focused on publishing open textbooks that are effectively indistinguishable in production value from commercial textbooks. In some cases, of course, this is because they literally secured the rights to former commercial textbooks. But to a lay faculty member who knows nothing about OER, an OpenStax book effectively looks, feels, and even tastes like a book published by Pearson or Cengage, although arguably without the bitter aftertaste. Now, you can see other illustrations of their focused pragmatism in their early partnerships with commercial actors who were interested in providing paid supports wrapped around their books, such as adaptive quizzing, or maybe their partnerships with print distribution companies to get into college bookstores. But you'd have to say that their strategy has been effective. OpenStax books are estimated to have saved students $2.9 billion since 2012. 7 million students from 150 countries use OpenStax, and that includes students at 70% of post-secondary institutions in the United States. So for me, there are many takeaways from the OpenStax project, but one of them is the value of taking a pragmatic approach, especially when you want to shift educator behavior without requiring a change in teaching culture. So I tip my hat to Richard Baraniak, Daniel Williamson, and their colleagues down in Houston. But of course, there are many other stalls in the bazaar of open textbooks. And one of the early alternative approaches to open textbooks that I had the opportunity to work on as an associate editor was the NOBA project. This is a project that was founded by Ed and Carol Diener. Now, if you're a psychologist, you probably know the name of Ed Diener. He's very famous for his work on happiness or subjective well-being, to use the term he coined. Ed sadly passed in April of 2021, but the NOBA project continues to be overseen by Robert Biswas Diener, Ed and Carol's son, and a well-known positive psychologist in his own right. Now, the genius of the NOBA project, in my mind, was manifold. First, you get past the prestige barrier. And by prestige, I mean that very sad proxy for quality that many educators rely on, name recognition. So what they did is they went to the leading scholars in subtopic areas of psychology, like, for example, Elizabeth Loftus for eyewitness memory, David Buss for evolutionary psychology, Susan Fisk for prejudice, and yes, James Penbaker as well. Thanks for catching that in the chat, Virginia. And they didn't ask them to write a whole textbook, nor even a full chapter, but instead short modules on their specific areas of expertise. They commissioned these modules in order to produce collections that would align with the major topics of a traditional intro psych course before moving on to other courses like social psychology. Now, for faculty members who preferred a more customized approach, they built an easy-to-use platform that allowed dragging and dropping and exporting in different formats. But they were not done yet. They went to content experts, yes. Then they went to award-winning teachers of psychology, part, in fact, of the leadership of the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, and commissioned them to develop learning activities, lecture slides, and assessment questions to go with each module. They systematically worked past all of the typical counter-arguments one gets when talking to somebody who's unfamiliar with OER, and they did so while approaching OER creation in a format that does not resemble a traditional textbook. So again, many lessons to be learned from the NOBA approach, including a focus on serving the community of a single discipline, as well as the creativity involved in developing a more accessible form of both OER authorship and required course readings. But for me, the especially powerful lesson from NOBA is to show how prestige can be both the problem and the solution. Yet another approach to the untextbook is, of course, the one adopted by Delmar Larsen at LibreTexts, cleverly ingesting every available open textbook within their web platform, embedding features such as dynamic 3D figures, Jupyter notebooks, and facilitating easy remixing. I really commend Delmar's vision with LibreText, and I want to acknowledge that the origin of that platform was in the marvelous ChemWiki project, which was an extensive hyperlinked network of topic modules in chemistry, Delmar's discipline, that involved the integration of both existing material by faculty and the construction of raw content by students. And I'm highlighting this origin because really, to the surprise of no one, it is the involvement of students in the co-construction of or co-authoring of OER via open pedagogy that I find perhaps the most exciting approach in the OER bazaar. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, open pedagogy may be understood, on the one hand, as an access-oriented commitment to learner-driven education, but also as a process of using tools and building architectures for learning that allow students to shape the public knowledge commons of which they are a part. An especially popular expression of open pedagogy comes with the design and use of renewable assignments, also sometimes known as non-disposable assignments. Now, it's a curious term, I'll admit, but it accurately captures how disposably traditional assessments are often treated, for after they are graded and picked up, they often end up in the recycling bin. By contrast, as this paper outlines, renewable assignments tend to be characterized by having three differences, really: a larger audience than the instructor, a longer life than the semester, and a greater impact than the individual student's learning. So open pedagogy could look like students creating or adapting OER, for example, by editing Wikipedia instead of writing a standard research essay, creating instructional videos instead of giving a classroom presentation, authoring test questions instead of answering them, or even annotating, adapting, and authoring open textbooks as a whole. Here are some glorious examples. Student-authored open textbooks. You can talk about Environmental Science Bites, volumes 1 and 2 by students at The Ohio State University. I've got that now. The Creative Process by students at the University of Washington. game design and development by students at TU Dublin, Indigenous teaching resources, students collection from Kwantlen Polytechnic University, Black Lives Matter collective storytelling project from students at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Beautiful works, all. And so to reflect, all of these models I'm sharing, the pragmatic approach from OpenStax, the modular single discipline approach from NOVA that leverages Prestige, the dynamic web-based approach from LibreText, and the student-driven approach from Open Pedagogy, they represent just some of the variety that is on offer today. I love this diversity because it makes for a much richer community, one that enables practitioners to pick and choose the ingredients to serve their community's palate or to suit their community's palate. Or if I'm going to continue with the building metaphor, we build with lessons that fit the contours of our landscape. Now, mind you, as I say this, excuse me, I also want to absolutely work to change the landscape as much as possible. And I will say as a university administrator, that is exactly what I see as part of my job, so that those with less positional power at the university do not have to place themselves at risk when they embrace greater openness. Right? This is why Kwantlen Polytechnic University and Brock University both have academic plans that prioritize open educational practices. This is why places like Brock and the University of British Columbia recognize the creation of open educational resources for tenure and promotion. We cannot ask early career scholars, we cannot ask adjunct faculty or staff or students to do the heavy lifting, right? As a tenured faculty member, this is my role. As a university administrator, this is my duty. Now, my final lesson is about never forgetting what and whom we are building for. And so I will quote Erin Okuno, who wrote that equity isn't for all. Equity is for those farthest from justice. And if we are working towards true equity, those farthest from justice can define for themselves what they need to be whole, healthy, and in just relations with others. As Sarah Lambert reminds us, in open education, we can intentionally orient our work towards at least 3 forms of justice. We have redistributive justice, which involves the allocation of material or even human resources towards those who by circumstance have less. So think about replacing a commercial textbook with OER, for example. But there's also recognitive justice, which involves recognition and respect for cultural and gender difference. Think about the sociocultural diversity in the open curriculum, for example. But you can go deeper still. There's representational justice, which involves equitable representation and political voice. And this is where, for an example, you can think about the co-construction of OER about learners of color by learners of color. Think about those reports that Arlie produced with her students. And as we think about these forms of social and epistemic justice, we should also be mindful of the difference, as articulated by Cheryl Hodgkinson Williams and Henry Trotter in their important social justice framework for OER. The difference between responses to injustice that are positive or ameliorative, right? But those that are positive and those that are actually transformative. There's a difference between those two. For example, reducing the cost of education by adopting open textbooks in place of commercial textbooks is positive, definitely, it's ameliorative. But a transformative response would do more to address the root causes of economic inequality. Think about providing stable power supply, adequate access to functional computing devices, affordable and stable connectivity in rural environments. Similarly, translating OER into local languages is positive and ameliorative, but a transformative response might include remixing OER critically to engage with and to challenge hegemonic perspectives. My collaborators Mahabali, Catherine Cronin, and I sought to extend this framework to broader open educational practices. And as you can see, we tried to articulate contexts in which OEP may be neutral or even negative if it's done without student agency, the choice to opt out of public scholarship, if it reproduces hegemonic knowledge, if students are not appropriately informed or even equipped on how to engage in open practice and its risks, because we know marginalized students are targeted and harassed online disproportionately. OEP can be ameliorative, right? If we address economic injustice, we produce resources and scholarship that become accessible to those who otherwise would not have access. But practices like these can either be more instructor-centered or learner-centered. They can either be content-centric or process-centric. They can be primarily about pedagogy, or they can be primarily about social justice. And these are the lines along which we will often see the difference between OEP that are ameliorative and those that are truly transformative. In the latter case, it is marginalized groups that are involved in the design of the content and the process, and both epistemologies and structural academic gatekeeping may be challenged. I confess it's given me a lot of joy over the years to see people and voices that have historically been marginalized within the academy, including within open education, speaking truth and speaking truth to power openly. At times, I will share, this has been met with tone policing or a perception that sharing these perspectives is divisive. But as the brilliant Sarah Ahmed writes in her fabulous book, you need to get this book, The Feminist Killjoy Handbook, you notice worlds when they are not built for you. And when you are someone who has experienced marginalization and exclusion directly inside your skin, you certainly do not need to be given the business case for inclusion, because injustice is not a theoretical construct for you. This is why it was such a joy working on the volume Open at the Margins, Critical Perspectives on Open Education, which is an attempt at critical pluriversalism. It is a curated collection of 38 blog posts, lectures, talks, articles, and other informal works contributed by 43 diverse authors, all published since 2013. All of these contributions, they focus on issues such as decolonizing the use of student data, openness and surveillance, digital redlining, and inequitable power dynamics of global knowledge production. They offer a perspective on open education that can be considered marginal and that challenges the dominant hegemony. I'm very grateful to each of the contributors, the Rebus community once again for supporting the publication of the volume, and especially my co-editors, Mahabali, Catherine Cronin, Laura Chernovich, and my favorite collaborator in the world, Robin DeRosa. So no, let us never, ever forget that the work of our patchwork of communities needs to be oriented not just towards affordability, although that is a noble goal, nor just towards student success, because Lord knows there are enough venture capital funded groups excitedly running around making grandiose claims along those lines. No, we orient our work towards justice. I'd like to close by sharing the words of 3 incredible women whose thinking and whose writings continue to help me to calibrate my moral compass. I will always remember Toni Morrison's direction. When you get these jobs that you've been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. I carry the wisdom of Bell Hooks with me, who said all of us in the academy and in the culture as a whole are called to renew our minds if we are to transform educational institutions and society so that the way we live, teach, and work can reflect our joy in cultural diversity, our passion for justice, and our love for freedom. And I especially hold on to the powerful words of Arundhati Roy, who said, another world is not only possible, folks, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you very, very much, everyone. This has been such an honor, and I can't wait to hear your questions, your comments, and get into the discussion. Over to you, Brendan.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. We do have a couple questions coming through the chat. So if anyone does have questions for Dr. Jhangiani, I encourage you, please use the Q&A feature found in the bottom bar of Zoom. So the first question comes from Rachel Becker. How do you suggest we use the OpenStax model, making open accessible and easy for faculty to adopt to expand the open movement?
It's a good question. I appreciate the question, Rachel. I will say for all of these questions, I certainly don't claim to be the arbiter of wisdom over here. So I'd love to hear people chiming in as well to help address some of these questions. But for me, the OpenStax model, as I said, has many, many lessons. I still remember a beautiful blog post that Robin DeRosa wrote at the heels of the OpenEd 15 conference, in which she talked about how, even though so much of our conversation is around textbooks, on the one hand, is that really the kind of progressive vision? Is that the ideal model for education in the first place? And I quite agree with her. But of course, when you work with faculty members, especially faculty members embedded and enmeshed in systems that they themselves are constrained by, it's really effective to be able to speak a language that they can comprehend and to start where they are most comfortable. So for me, a part of the OpenStax model is understanding that, when you're inviting people to open education, it does not have to be always, burn everything down and start again. Although, believe me, many of us have that instinct a lot. It can simply be about start where you're comfortable, because people can gravitate towards greater openness over time. Even with OpenStax, I've known enough people who start by simply adopting it and not changing anything about pedagogy. Using it 2-3 semesters later, they realized, you know what, now I know what I would change about this book. And they move from OER adopters to OER adapters. And it goes further and it goes further and it goes further. So, I absolutely love the models that are non-textbook models, but I admire the singular focus on the model that OpenStax has advanced. They've really helped change the tone of discussion, and they've critically ended up making an impact on students, particularly at that first year level with the large high enrollment survey courses. And I'll maybe just add one other point over there, because on the one hand, you may say, yes, of course, people tend to invest in first year courses because there's a higher return on investment even as a philanthropic organization. But one of the reasons why I love the focus on first and second year courses is that first generation students do not have access to the hidden curriculum. They do not know the creative ways to get access to course materials that those who are not first gen students often are aware of. They are often making expensive mistakes. And so if we can make it easier for them to enter university without suffering those mistakes, without experiencing food insecurity, this is even more vital. So for me, I appreciate what OpenStax is doing. I love that they are not the only dish at the buffet, but I absolutely love that they are there. I hope that helps.
Great. And I think that also answered another of the questions that came through. So that is perfect. You use the term decolonizing in relation to student data. Can you explain what decolonization means in this context?
Yeah, and I think I was referring to, and thank you for the question. I think I was referring to one of the chapters in the volume Open at the Margins that actually gets into this in some detail as well. It's interesting to talk about data today, of course, in the context of generative AI. And, I confess, I had a moment, a couple of months ago when I had a whole section of this talk that I was envisioning that would be about generative AI, and it didn't go there. So I feel like this is now when I go here. But I'm sharing this because, when I think about generative AI, for all of the problems it has, the amplification of existing societal biases is one of them. The paving over the etymology of knowledge by completely disregarding attribution is another one. And so extracting knowledge, extracting labor, extracting data while ignoring its origins is quite a colonial approach. So I suppose today, when we talk about decolonizing data, I certainly want to talk about data sovereignty in terms of generative AI. But even the question of, not everything that could be open should be open is an important lesson when it comes to decolonizing data, right? We have a tendency as an open community to think about, well, open by default, sure. But sometimes agency is more important than openness. Sometimes openness can be exploitative. And if you're talking about traditional knowledge, that's a good example. There's sacred knowledge that only certain members of indigenous communities should have access to, or sometimes it's limited to a particular gender or a particular season. If you're interested in learning more about some of those subtleties, I encourage you to visit the website Local Contexts, plural, which has a whole section about the traditional knowledge or TK labels. And that again gives you another kind of glimpse at another sort of frontier, if you will, about where we need to talk about the colonization of data and the decolonization of data. So I hope that helps, but I appreciate the sharing of the chapter in the chat. But as I said, I'll also point to localcontexts.org. Thank you, Ash Barbara, for sharing that in the chat.
Thank you for the fantastic talk. You touched a little on this, but I was wondering about your thoughts on designing sustainable OERs. I'm thinking about how often materials are created for particular projects, but then are not discoverable nor easily adaptable beyond a year or two.
Yeah, it's a great point. I have so many things I want to say to this. I'm going to try to gather my thoughts, but I will acknowledge that there's some fascinating subtleties that we've seen over the years. Back in the day, when I was working with BC Campus, there was a paper we published that looked at models or patterns by which OER were being adopted. And it was with the faculty fellows at BC Campus, it was something like 8 patterns of open textbook adoption. Somebody can find it. You can place it in the chat. Hilariously, at the time, this was pre-COVID, clearly, we were talking about inter-institutional carriers who were infecting other faculty. And, maybe not the best language in retrospect, but the idea was there. And one of the patterns we certainly saw was a tendency on the part of more prestigious institutions, shall we say, to be more reticent to reuse OER that's created at, let's say, community colleges. They were much more interested in producing, less interested in reusing. So I think there's some interesting cultural nuances that sort of come up and butt against your question to some degree. But I do think there are some really thoughtful, clever people who've been working on the issue you're talking about, whether it is the folks at SUNY Geneseo who have helped create this sort of almost like a meta search engine for OER by digging into different repositories to make discoverability a bit easier. Certainly, Pressbooks itself creating a bit of a directory so you can find anything else that's been made in a Pressbooks platform, even if it's not in your instance or your jurisdiction. But I think you're making a really good point. I think part of it is a technical challenge, part of it is a cultural challenge. And I think, if we continue to consider or confer, really is the word, more prestige on creation projects instead of adaptation projects, this is only feeding into this cycle, right? So even for us at Brock, I'm thrilled that our tenure and promotion policy recognizes the creation of open educational resources. I'd like it to go a bit further, quite frankly. It is flashy and nice to do something new. But the hard work of progress is when you build on other people's work. And of course, that's a basic premise of open education. You adapt before you create, right? And so I absolutely agree with what you're talking about, but I think it's a complicated challenge, most of which is probably cultural, I think. And so finding ways to align incentives so that, ongoing development of OER, whether it is embedding it in open pedagogy, working with students, whether it is, through communities that exist in LibreText that are embracing it. There's a few different approaches over here, but I don't think that puzzle has been solved yet exactly. So I think it's a great question, great observation.
How can we use open education to reorient our teaching away from student compliance and towards student empowerment? What sort of introspection about our own relationship to authority as educators is necessary in pursuit of aesthetic justice through open education?
Wow, what a question, Justin. That's a stunning question. I love the question. It feels like, that is a seminar by itself. That's a whole series, that's a volume. I do think there's some incredible people doing fabulous work in this space. Help me out, folks. I'm thinking about particular work, especially, and Lord, you're going to hear from Jasmine Roberts-Cruz, one of the champions of this space later in this conference. But Jasmine, you've been working on, if you're here in the room, you've been working on some pieces with Lindsay Gavouche, for example. That's one area that I'm thinking about. But I think the question is right to think about the power dynamics over here. It's a challenging situation, especially when you are swimming upstream, or at least against the current, right? When everything from your, it's not just your gender can affect student course evaluations of teaching, as we know very, very well. But anytime you're doing something different and radical, or anything that's perceived as being out of step with the norm, you often suffer penalties, even when it comes to student evaluations of teaching, or, of course, that affects things like tenure and promotion. So I'm sort of mentioning this because I think one needs to be very cognizant of the risks involved in playing with the power dynamics in the classroom, even if you're doing it for the right reasons, and even if the students who are most marginalized are benefiting the greatest. And so I think it needs to be a critical discussion. It needs to be a critical approach. Part of it is thinking about, even today, what is our role as educators in the classroom? And there's a degree to which, we need to be comfortable with, not claiming to know everything, but, everything from how our classrooms are set up to how our learning management systems operate, to how learning outcomes claim to dictate what the journey will look like before we've met our students. Everything leads us to a particular approach to teaching and learning that looks a lot more like what Paulo Freire described as the banking concept of education, right? Where teachers are the depositors and students are the depositories. And so playing with that is really a question about how do I embrace critical pedagogy in the classroom in a way that also harnesses openness. And I think for me, that starts with really understanding what your philosophy is, what you're trying to achieve, and make those changes consciously, but not without, not in ignorance of the risks that you're undertaking at the same time. But this is a vastly inadequate answer to an incredible question. So I can only suggest that this is something I think we need to think about. This is something that needs a lot more attention in this space. I'll also just mention in passing that a graduate student at Brock University, one of the superstars of the future, I promise you, Oya Pakal, is in the chat right now in this room. Oya and I are working on a study right now with Lindsay Gavush, who's at Roger Williams University and the New England Board of Higher Education, that is attempting to operationalize different elements of epistemic and social justice in a way that can be manifested through what is going to be your approach to course materials, what is going to be your approach to learning activities, to learning assessments and things like that. It's not a simple, straightforward thing. But there are other people that have done similar work as well that have provided some practical guidance. And if Richard Sebastian and his colleagues are here, they might be able to point to Achieving the Dream, put out a framework for culturally inclusive teaching that doesn't talk about it in the context of critical pedagogy, but it really is. And so I'd point to that as well. But again, thank you for the phenomenal question.
My faculty are pretty enthusiastic about intro and advanced courses using open affordable resources, but find it difficult to identify resources at the intermediate level. Do you have any advice specific to intermediate courses? I've heard this from faculty in many disciplines.
Yeah, no, I love the question. I think there are really fun answers to this, and I don't want to assume that Beth is not working in the library, but of course my first answer would be if you're not working in the library or working with the library, that's got to be your first port of call. But more often than not, I find that if you reach out to community, let's talk to, maybe you're a member of the Open Education Network or some other regional group perhaps, talk to your community and pose this question. I find that connecting faculty members in specific subject areas with like-minded faculty members at other institutions in the same area is really a magical approach. It really helps them to not feel alone, especially if they are dealing with, being the minority in their department, for example. And so connecting them builds that sense of community and sharing of resources. What are you doing? I've tried this. Have you tried this? Did you know this resource exists? So that's wonderful and organic, and building that community helps. But, of course, the reality is sometimes we're talking about courses at the upper level for which we're not actually changing practice either. Because if it's a niche area, there's often no commercial textbook available anyway. So you might be talking course packs or other kinds of things. And so it may be a conversation with the library about collections, about how can we strategically use our collections budget to subscribe to e-resources, to do other things in order to alleviate the cost burden for students. Even if it's not all open, it can at least be zero textbook cost. Connecting the faculty member with colleagues is, of course, another approach, as I said. Looking for opportunities for collaborative projects as well. There may be resources that exist, but your faculty member is sort of thinking, well, it's not quite there. I'm not comfortable going with it. The number of times I've seen collaborative projects emerge where you have, pooled expertise from different institutions is incredible. I'll give you one concrete example. Back in 2014, Clint Lalonde from BC Campus and I ran a sprint across 2 days, working with 17 faculty members from 7 different institutions in the province to create some OER. And it was incredible because not all of them were sort of into OER. They didn't know about it, but they came in for other things. We made it an interesting, attractive event. But following the event, because they had contributed to it, because they had skin in the game, almost every institution had adopted that resource at the end of the day. So I do think you can look for those collaborative creation opportunities, but first I would build community, look at librarians, And I do see that, I totally agree that as Michael Kahn says in the chat, the ebooks come and go, and Lord knows this is not a neutral space, right? We know that vendors are actively trying to prevent the use of digital licensing in this fashion. But for me, making some headway with the range of strategies that at your disposal is a worthwhile effort. It may not get to zero textbook costs at one go, but I will say, even if somebody gets involved in working in open educational resources, even if they cannot alleviate the cost burden for their students, there's a dramatic change that happens within you as an instructor when you work with students, when you see that, when you understand that process from the inside. And so, involving yourself in open education projects, I think is a bit of a game changer, even for you as an individual. But of course, you could also look at open pedagogy projects and a few other options. So I would say, just as a follow-up, and I think it was Beth, I can't remember the name exactly. But Beth, if you mention your discipline in the chat, I think that's where we can actually harness the 400 or 500 people who are in the room right now. Because if you mention the discipline, the specific topic area, believe me, I've seen questions go out on the Open Education Network's listserv, and goodness, I mean, just the responses that come in. The community is really, really thrilled to help. And so just, I would say, ask out in the open.
And you were correct. It was Beth. Last question, just looking at the time right now. I appreciate the sharing about post-secondary, but can you please speak to the K-12 model? Do you know of anyone in K-12 that you could recommend, Rajiv?
A few people. I mean, I wish I could speak to the K-12 model, to be honest. You might even be better off speaking with my wife, who's a faculty member in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia. But there's a few people I would point to. If you're working in Canada, I would point to Constance Connie Blomgren at Athabasca University, who's done a lot of work in this space. Verena Roberts is another person who's at Thompson Rivers University. Those are two people in Canada who do a lot of work in this space, of course. And if you're in the United States, I mean, goodness, I would certainly want to start with the highly impressive Christina Ishmael as well. But yeah, the Department of Education's Go Open initiative, I think there's a lot to learn from them. But the dynamics are really quite different, of course, between higher ed and K-12, and especially between US and Canada. So I cannot claim expertise in the space. And thank you to others in the chat who are pointing to other points of reference in that community, including Sarah Hamishmaim. Thank you very much. And Brandon, as I hand back to you, I just want to thank everybody again. This has been such an honor. I've been a member of this community for a long time, and this means a lot to me. I appreciate the questions and the thoughtful engagement, but I really also want to say, please don't be a stranger, right? I can't wait to see some of you in person if we move in that direction next year. But please do reach out. We are really, really here to help one another. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jhangiani. That was an amazing keynote. I'd now like to pass it on to my colleague, Tanja.
Thank you, Brandon. And thank you again, Dr. Rajiv. As we stated earlier, that we have been in this community for 20 years in reference to this conference. And as Dr. Rajiv basically stated, that community is a verb. And so we encourage you again to think about over the next couple of days exactly how you will help us to continue to sustain for the next 20 years. If community is a verb, it's an action. Again, we all need to come together and to contribute so we can be able to sustain 20 years and more. So with that being said, I would like to welcome you again to Open Ed 23. We have an exciting program in store for you the rest of today, starting with the live concurrent session that will begin in 30 minutes, followed by a 30-minute breakout session, where you will join attendees in your respective region of the world for an informal discussion about your unique experience with open education. Also, be sure to browse the pre-recorded sessions that are welcome to begin watching now, or bookmark for later. Finally, join us this evening for our daily brief, Open Ed's talk show recap of the day, and grab your favorite beverage or snacks to join the informal chit chat at the opening reception at the opening reception, basically discussing again, what's going to be our contribution? What's our next plan of action for the next 20 years? If you found this morning's remarkable keynote and insightful as I did, make sure to join us tomorrow for the preliminary featuring Jasmine Roberts Cruz. Her topic is There Must Be an Alternative, Embracing a Post-Oppositional Approach to Social Justice and Open Education. This talk will be scheduled for 2 p.m. We will now transition to our first scheduled break for the next 30 minutes. Thank you.